If you were standing in Nevada's high desert on the eve of a summer storm, you'd know there's a kind of silence that only comes when nature is waiting to roar. Claire Hemsworth knew that silence well. The air gets heavy, like a held breath, and every creature disappears. But Claire was not one to be spooked by weather, or by the high, lonely places where the earth cracks wide open. She hiked alone, boots crunching over sharp stones, a battered canvas pack bouncing against her back, and a GPS clipped to her belt that beeped every time she paused to mark a new soil sample. For years, Claire had made this wilderness her second home. Early 40s, with close-cropped hair and the kind of sun-leathered skin you earn through long field seasons, she was more comfortable with the hum of insects than the buzz of city life. Even now, as the sky turned an ugly iron color and her phone screamed another storm alert, she ignored it. There was one more patch of sandy soil she had to collect before heading down. She had rules, yes, but she also had something to prove. The day had started easy, just wind and the distant shimmer of wild Mustangs running across the flats. But by afternoon, the air grew tense, and a bruise-colored line of clouds hunched on the horizon. She had just knelt to scoop her last sample when the wind suddenly rose, howling around the rocky ledges, sending pebbles skittering over the edge. Claire stood, bracing against a sudden gust, when her foot slid on a patch of loose shale. For one terrible second, she hung in the balance. Then the world tilted beneath her. The ground vanished. She tumbled, arms flailing for anything to catch. Rocks slammed against her side. A jagged branch tore at her jacket. She slammed down hard, rolling, scraping, until finally she crashed to a halt in a bone-dry creek bed at the bottom of a narrow canyon. Everything hurt. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The sky above was just a thin ribbon, framed by steep, unforgiving rock walls. Claire tried to move and gasped. Her left leg flared with white-hot pain, and she tasted blood in her mouth. She forced herself to take inventory, left ankle throbbing and twisted, probably broken, right hand bleeding but moving, head spinning. Her pack had burst open, tools and notebooks strewn across the rocks. Most importantly, her radio, the lifeline in any field emergency, was gone. She saw it lying 10 feet away, battery case cracked, antenna snapped. She tried her cell phone next. No service. The sky above rumbled, sending a scatter of small stones clattering down into the gulch. Somewhere up there, wind howled like a living thing. Claire gritted her teeth, pulled herself to a sitting position, and wrapped her hands around her leg to press the pain back down. She remembered a time, years ago, in a different life, when pain would have sent her into a panic. But after Afghanistan, after losing her sister, pain was just data. Measure it, accept it, move forward. She tried to splint her leg with a stick from her pack, tying it off with a bandana, her hands shaking only a little. Night was falling fast. The temperature dropped sharply in the high desert. She could feel the cold already licking at her skin, seeping through her damp jacket. She had no tent, no way to climb out. Every wall above was slick with loose gravel, impossible to scale even with 2 working legs. Blood trickled down her shin, soaking into her sock. Claire scanned the canyon, fighting dizziness. She knew that if the storm broke before help arrived, if help ever arrived, she could be dead before sunrise. She forced herself to focus. What did she have left? Her emergency blanket, some trail mix, a tiny flashlight with a dying bulb. She reached for her water bottle, unscrewed the cap, and took a careful sip, calculating every ounce. Above her, thunder boomed. The sky went almost black, and a scatter of cold raindrops spattered the rocks. The canyon, for all its wide-open sky, felt like a trap now, a place for bones to vanish. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote barked once, and then silence closed in again. Claire shifted, wincing as her splinted leg brushed a sharp stone. Every movement sent fresh pain jolting up her spine. Her mind wandered, flashes of her old life, her sister's laugh, the faces of people she'd lost along the way. She was not afraid of wild places, but tonight the wild felt different, alien, watching, almost sentient. A flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the canyon walls in stark white. Claire jerked in surprise. Was that movement? For a heartbeat, she thought she saw a shape on the ridge above. A long, pale figure, mane whipping in the wind. Impossible. She squeezed her eyes shut, blaming shock and exhaustion. But when she looked again, the shape was still there. And then, more shapes, ghostly forms lined up along the rim of the canyon, silhouetted against the flicker of distant lightning. Mustangs. A whole herd, staring down at her with unblinking eyes. Claire's first thought was fear. Wild horses were unpredictable. If they bolted or lost their footing, they could bring rocks tumbling down onto her. If they spooked, they might trample her by accident. She pulled her silver emergency blanket around her shoulders and pressed herself against the rock wall, trying to make herself as small as possible. She was shivering now, breath coming in shallow gasps. Rain began to fall in earnest, cold needles stinging her skin. The herd didn't move, not at first. One of them, a stallion, larger and paler than the rest, stepped forward, nostrils flaring, watching her with a gaze so intense she felt pinned to the earth. Another flash of lightning, and Claire saw him clearly. Silver mane, powerful chest, scars on his flank like lightning bolts of his own. For a second, something passed between them, a flicker of recognition, or maybe just the desperate hope of a woman trapped at the edge of night. Then the storm broke in full, and the wild world came alive. Thunder cracked like cannon fire, ricocheting off the canyon walls. The herd didn't scatter. Instead, they seemed to merge from the darkness, shadowy figures growing solid with each stroke of lightning. Claire's pulse thudded in her ears, her hands gripping the emergency blanket so tightly her knuckles blanched. She thought she might be hallucinating from pain and exhaustion. But no. This was real. Wild mustangs stood above her, their eyes shining in the storm. A fierce wind ripped through the gulch, stinging rain pelting her face. The silver stallion, Phantom, stood out from the others, his coat gleaming ghost-like as he planted himself at the very edge of the drop-off. His mane thrashed in the gale, his hooves steady even as pebbles clattered down the slope. The herd hovered behind him, every muscle tense, uncertain. Claire forced herself to stay still, fighting the urge to call out or move. Her survival instincts screamed, "Don't make noise, don't draw attention, wild horses can stampede." But something in Phantom's stillness made her hesitate. He didn't seem frightened. He looked intent. Suddenly, a smaller shape picked its way down the rocks, hooves skidding on loose gravel. It was a young colt, barely past foalhood, spindly legs trembling but determined. Claire held her breath as the colt paused a few feet from her. For a moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, the colt stretched out his neck, nudging something toward her with his nose. Claire stared, heart pounding. The silver blanket she'd been clutching had slipped away in her fall. Now the colt nudged it closer, as if offering protection. The gesture was so gentle, so deliberate, that Claire almost cried right there, overwhelmed by the simple kindness. The wind howled louder, driving rain sideways, slicing through the thin fabric of her jacket. Claire curled into herself, pulling the blanket back around her shoulders, shivering uncontrollably. She expected the herd to bolt, to vanish into the night. But instead, they began to move in a slow, purposeful arc, forming a rough circle around her, bodies angled against the storm. Their presence was not menacing, but deliberate, a living barricade between her and the world's fury. Phantom, still at the front, pawed the ground once, then lowered his head, his gaze locked on Claire. He was close enough now that she could see the flecks of mud on his chest, the old scars that webbed his flank. Lightning struck nearby, illuminating the entire canyon, and for a second, the silver stallion looked as if he'd been sculpted from the very storm itself. A burst of thunder sent two mares rearing, their hooves flailing dangerously close. Claire flinched, but Phantom stamped, snorted, and the herd settled. He seemed to command them not with fear, but with something more, some silent authority that calmed the panic. As the night deepened, the rain intensified. The herd's bodies became a living wall, warm, solid, impenetrable. Claire felt their heat radiate toward her, a strange comfort in her pain. She blinked away tears, unsure if they came from relief or fear or the icy wind. Her consciousness flickered. Each time she fought to stay awake, the world blurred around the edges. A distant memory bubbled up. Her sister, years ago, tucking a blanket around her during a childhood thunderstorm. "Don't worry, Claire Bear. I'll keep watch. The storm can't get you when I'm here." That was before war, before loss, before everything that turned comfort into something rare and fragile. A sharp crack of thunder yanked Claire back. A young mare, trembling, pressed closer to the circle. Phantom turned his head, nickered softly, and the herd shifted, tightening their formation. It was uncanny, how they seemed to operate as a unit, not just for themselves, but for her. Claire tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was just a curiosity, a wounded animal not worth attacking. Or maybe, just maybe, there was something more at work. The rain slowed for a moment. Claire blinked as the colt reappeared, nosing through the mud. She realized with a jolt that the little horse had found her whistle. Her field whistle dropped in the tumble down the ridge. The colt pushed it toward her, lips working at the plastic, then stepped back, watching. Claire's voice came out as a croak. Why are you helping me?" No answer, of course. Just the soft snort of the colt, the steady presence of Phantom, the warm bodies of the herd forming a fragile shield. She reached out a trembling hand, and the colt sniffed her fingers before dancing back to the safety of the group. Another peal of thunder rolled through, and Phantom pawed the ground, eyes never leaving Claire. She had the sense, unmistakable, bone deep, that the stallion was making a choice, not acting on instinct alone. He could have led his herd away. Instead, he stayed. They all stayed. The wind shifted, bringing a chill so sharp that Claire gasped, but the herd pressed closer, blocking the worst of it. The world narrowed to the circle of wild bodies, the hiss of rain, the wet earth beneath her. She tucked the whistle into her jacket, grateful for the smallest reminder of control. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time twisted around pain and fear. The sky flashed with lightning again and again, shadows dancing on the canyon walls. Every so often, the herd shifted, murmuring to each other in low nickers and squeals. Phantom alone remained utterly still, planted between Claire and the full fury of the storm. At one point, a massive branch, torn loose by the wind, crashed down just yards away. Claire flinched, expecting the herd to panic, to flee and leave her exposed. Instead, Phantom surged forward, stamping at the fallen limb, his presence bold and protective. The herd bunched tighter. The moment passed. The rain drummed on. Fatigue pulled at Claire, threatening to drag her under. She fought it, focusing on the simple, rhythmic breathing of the horses around her. It became a lullaby, the inhale and exhale, the rise and fall, like the tide coming in and out. Her mind drifted, flitting between wakefulness and sleep, never fully surrendering. At last, sometime deep into the night, the storm began to break. The wind softened to a mournful sigh. The rain tapered to mist. Claire looked up, dazed, and saw Phantom's silhouette standing guard, the colt sleeping tucked against his side. For the first time in hours, she let herself believe she might survive the night. The herd didn't move. They held their silent vigil, and Claire, bruised and broken but fiercely alive, knew she'd witnessed something she could never fully explain. A night when the wild chose not to run, but to stand. Night in the canyon felt endless, as if time itself had frozen, refusing to budge until the storm had spent every last drop of fury. Claire hovered in a space between sleep and wakefulness, pain flickering through her body like static electricity. Every nerve in her fractured leg screamed with each twitch. She wrapped the silver blanket around herself as tightly as she could, pulling her knees up, but the pain wouldn't be contained. The herd remained close, their warm bodies sheltering her from the worst of the cold. Their breathing rose and fell in a slow, mesmerizing rhythm, so unlike the frantic pace of her own chest. She let her eyes close just for a moment, and was pulled down into memory. In that strange, sleepless twilight, the past came rushing up, scenes from a different world, one she rarely let herself visit. She saw herself standing in army fatigues, dust and grit plastered to her skin, her fingers trembling on the trigger of a weapon she had sworn she would never need to use. She saw the face of her younger sister, laughing in a summer field, wind in her hair. That was before the accident, before grief hardened something inside Claire that had once been open and soft. The wind whistled through the canyon, dragging her back to the present. She looked up at the herd, their bodies forming a loose shield, the edges of their coats gleaming where moonlight broke through cracks in the cloud cover. Phantom was still there, motionless except for the occasional twitch of his ear, ever alert. The young colt, restless, shifted and nudged his dam, then tiptoed closer to Claire, curiosity shining in his big dark eyes. Every so often, Claire tried to speak. "Hey, little one." Her voice rasped out, barely louder than the whisper of the wind. The colt snuffled her boot, then danced away, tail flicking, as if inviting her to play a game she had no strength for. Even in her pain, the colt's innocence tugged at something deep inside her. A flash of lightning illuminated the faces of the Mustangs, alert, cautious, but not afraid. Claire found herself thinking about everything she had ever been taught as a scientist. That wild animals acted on instinct, that their behavior could be mapped, graphed, reduced to survival strategies. But what she saw now was more complicated. These horses had chosen to stay, to protect a wounded stranger, even as the storm threatened them as well. The whistle, the one the colt had brought her, rested now inside her jacket. She turned it over in her fingers, feeling the grooves where her teeth had once gnawed at the plastic as a nervous young recruit. "Why did you help me?" she whispered, the words floating into the night, meant for no one and everyone. There was no reply, only the steady breathing of the herd and the distant groan of the wind. She drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes she woke, heart pounding, convinced she heard her sister's voice echoing off the canyon walls. Other times, the world dissolved into pain and cold, and she gritted her teeth, determined not to let the darkness claim her. Her training as a soldier and a scientist gave her grit, but what sustained her most now was the presence of the herd, Their warmth, their vigilance, the strange, quiet sense that she was not alone. At one point, Claire felt a nose bump her shoulder, gentle, insistent. She opened her eyes to find the colt standing over her, his breath warm against her cheek. He nudged her arm as if encouraging her to keep fighting, to stay awake. She smiled weakly. "You're a stubborn little guy, aren't you?" The colt whickered softly and returned to the safety of Phantom's side. A new sound filtered through the darkness, the distant rumble of thunder fading, replaced by a chorus of coyotes howling from somewhere high above. The herd responded by pressing closer, Phantom stamping his hoof, snorting a warning to the shadows. Claire wondered if she should be afraid, but the horse's presence gave her courage. Out here, she was part of their circle, at least for one extraordinary night. As the long hours crawled by, Claire's thoughts turned to her work. The data she had collected, the research she had hoped would change minds about wild horses and their role in fragile desert ecosystems. But lying here, half broken, she realized none of her spreadsheets or charts could capture this moment, the raw, unfiltered kindness of a wild stallion and his family. It wasn't science. It was something deeper. A sudden movement caught her eye. Phantom shifted, stepping between her and the mouth of the canyon, body tense. Claire heard it too, a faint, metallic clink, like rocks tumbling underfoot. For a heart-stopping instant, she thought it might be another person, maybe even a predator. But no, only a stray boulder dislodged by the retreating storm, crashing harmlessly down the canyon wall. The danger passed. The herd relaxed again, returning to their quiet vigil. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and sage, electric with the fading memory of rain. Claire breathed it in, letting the clean, wild smell fill her lungs. Her mind drifted once more, not to war or loss, but to hope. She imagined what her sister would have said if she could see her now, trapped, broken, yet alive because of the very creatures she'd devoted her career to studying. Maybe, Claire thought, this was what healing looked like. Not a sudden miracle, but a slow thaw, a moment of grace delivered by those you least expect. The sky began to lighten, just a little, a pale silver creeping over the canyon rim. The worst of the night was over, the wind calmed, and the herd's breathing grew even slower, deeper. The colt curled up beside Phantom, eyelids fluttering. For the first time in hours, Claire allowed herself to believe that rescue might be possible. If she could hold on just a little longer, if the herd continued to guard her through the dawn. She forced herself to stay awake, replaying every detail, memorizing the faces of the horses, the texture of their coats, the gentle kindness in their eyes. No matter what happened next, she would never be the same. In the canyon's deepest darkness, she had found something she didn't even know she was missing, a wild, wordless connection, as old as time. Above her, Phantom lifted his head and looked toward the coming dawn. He didn't neigh or rear or bolt. He simply stood, solid and immovable, the living answer to a question Claire had never dared to ask. And in that silent promise, Claire found the strength to wait for morning. Morning in the canyon did not break gently. It arrived all at once, a burst of pale light slicing through the ragged cloud cover, igniting every drop of dew that clung to the sage and scrub like tiny diamonds. Claire felt it before she saw it, a subtle shift in the air, a promise of warmth returning to the bruised earth. She opened her eyes, squinting into the new day, and found herself still surrounded by the herd. For a moment, she wondered if the night had only been a fevered dream, conjured by her mind as a defense against pain and fear. But the ache in her leg was all too real, the cold grit on her cheek, the sharp, grassy smell of the Mustangs. All of it proof that what she'd lived through was no fantasy. The herd, too, was different in the daylight. Their coats glistened with moisture, every muscle outlined by the rising sun. Phantom was still on guard, silver mane tousled and wet. But he looked softer now, less a spirit of the storm and more a flesh-and-blood guardian. The colt was dozing at his side, legs tucked under, tail flicking at the occasional fly. All around her, the other horses stirred, nipping gently at each other, stretching, adjusting their circle but never leaving her unprotected. A single sharp pain jolted Claire fully awake. She gritted her teeth and forced herself to assess the damage again. Her leg was swollen, but the crude splint had held. Blood had dried on her calf and ankle, and her water bottle was nearly empty. She knew she couldn't last much longer without help. Even as the sky brightened, she felt the weight of exhaustion pulling her down. That's when she heard it, the faint, rhythmic thrum of something man-made, echoing from far down the canyon. At first, it sounded like another trick of the wind, but it grew steadily louder. A helicopter, the search and rescue kind, the sort that meant hope for people lost in wild places. Claire pushed herself upright with a gasp, vision swimming as the sudden movement sent white-hot pain shooting up her leg. The horses tensed around her, ears swiveling toward the noise. The herd grew uneasy, shuffling, nickering, unsure if this new threat meant safety or danger. Phantom turned to her then, as if reading her mind. He stood tall, nostrils flared, muscles bunched, tail raised high. The helicopter drew closer, chopping through the air, the roar bouncing off the canyon's stone walls. Claire saw the glint of sunlight on the windshield, the bold red cross painted on its belly. She knew what to do, if only she could make herself seen. She reached for the whistle around her neck, but her hand trembled too much to lift it to her lips. Desperation welled up. The helicopter would not spot her easily in this rocky labyrinth, especially with her silver blanket half buried and the Mustangs blocking her from above. Then Phantom made his decision. With a sudden, powerful surge, the stallion leaped up the slope, hooves thundering against the loose stones. He reached the rim in a flash, mane and tail streaming like a comet. The herd parted as he passed, watching him with wide, trusting eyes. At the highest point of the canyon wall, Phantom threw back his head and let loose a neigh that seemed to shake the very ground. A piercing, resonant call that echoed across the valley, impossibly loud, impossibly wild. The sound startled every living creature for miles. Birds erupted from the trees, startled jackrabbits scattered, and even the rescue team in the helicopter seemed to pause. For a few heartbeats, everything was still. Claire stared up at the stallion in awe, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She saw the colt scramble up behind him, adding a second, higher voice to the chorus. The herd below stomped and tossed their heads, energized by the call. The helicopter banked hard, circling once and then veered directly toward the sound. Claire waved her arm, using every ounce of strength she had left, but she knew it was Phantom's call that had drawn their attention. The aircraft hovered, lowering toward the only open space near the canyon floor. Minutes blurred as figures in bright jackets rappelled down, moving swiftly and professionally. Claire's head spun. She tried to call out, but her voice was barely a croak. It didn't matter. The rescuers saw her waving urgently, and the herd broke apart, finally giving way, retreating to the far end of the canyon. The team moved with calm precision, voices clipped but kind. They checked her pulse, asked her name, assessed her leg. Claire clung to consciousness, determined not to pass out now. "There was a herd," she mumbled. "Horses. They protected me." One rescuer, a young woman with kind eyes, glanced at the horses still lingering nearby. "Looks like you had some company, ma'am." They wrapped her in blankets, gave her water, and began prepping her for the airlift. Phantom and the Colt watched from the rim, utterly still, as if standing sentinel. Claire was loaded into a stretcher, carefully hoisted up to the waiting helicopter. As the rotors thundered to life and the aircraft lifted off, Claire looked down through the open door. For a fleeting moment, time slowed. She saw Phantom and the Colt, standing side by side at the canyon's edge, unflinching, unmoved by the chaos. Their eyes found hers, steady, silent, ancient. They never ran. That image burned into her memory as the helicopter soared skyward. The wild horses, still and proud, refusing to turn their backs on the wounded stranger they'd guarded through the storm. Claire felt a wave of gratitude so profound it left her breathless. Inside the chopper, the rescue team chattered about vitals and trauma kits, but Claire tuned them out. She kept her eyes on the shrinking canyon below until Phantom and the Colt were no more than silver flecks against the earth. As the sun climbed higher, chasing the last of the storm away, Claire let her eyes close. She whispered a silent thank you to the wild, knowing deep down that what had happened would change her forever. She had entered the canyon alone, guided by logic, driven by duty. But she left it forever changed, marked by the mysterious, defiant compassion of those who had chosen not to run. The first thing Claire remembered after the rescue was the soft beep of monitors, the hum of an IV drip, and the distant aroma of disinfectant, a far cry from the wild scents of sage and horse sweat. The hospital room was too bright, the bed too soft, and the silence oddly sterile. She drifted in and out of sleep, half dreaming of the canyon, the storm, and the wild herd that had stood sentinel through the longest night of her life. She woke to the sound of voices in the hall, clipped, urgent, and insistent. When the door opened, a nurse entered with a cautious smile. "There's someone from the local paper waiting to see you, and a handful of TV people downstairs. Your story's gone, well, viral." Claire blinked, not quite understanding. But then the nurse handed her a phone, and there it was. Her face, battered and pale, in a hospital gown, splashed across headlines on every major news site. The most popular read, in bold caps, "Wild Stallion Saves Woman's Life." Underneath was a photo someone had snapped from the rescue. Her on the stretcher, wild Mustangs watching from the canyon rim. Within days, the story ballooned beyond anything Claire could have imagined. News anchors debated the details. Morning shows ran dramatic reenactments, with actors playing Phantom and the Colt, galloping heroically through wind machines. Talk shows invited experts to dissect the event. Was it animal instinct, a fluke of nature, or was something extraordinary at play? A well-known animal behaviorist was quoted saying, "There's no evidence that wild horses act to save humans. The stallion's behavior was likely protective of his herd, not the injured woman." Another expert fired back, "This is the kind of story that challenges everything we think we know about animal intelligence." For every scientist arguing that it was all coincidence, there was a commentator insisting that what had happened in that canyon defied easy explanation. The local sheriff, wanting to keep things calm, told reporters, "She's lucky to be alive, but let's not go making legends out of horses." Still, the public couldn't get enough. The footage of Phantom standing tall as the helicopter hovered became a viral loop on social media, shared and reshared with captions like, "Real-life spirit," "Guardian of the Canyon," and "Nature's Angels." Claire, meanwhile, felt adrift. She should have been grateful to be alive, and she was. but the glare of attention was disorienting, even suffocating. She gave a brief, careful interview from her hospital bed, answering questions with as much restraint as she could. When the anchor asked, "Did you feel that the stallion was protecting you consciously?" Claire paused, the memory of Phantom's unwavering presence vivid in her mind. "I can only tell you what I saw. That horse made a choice. He stayed." It was the truth, but she knew the world would twist it into whatever story fit best. Headlines multiplied. Woman claims wild stallion made choices to save her. A viral meme showed Phantom photoshopped with a superhero cape, standing over a cartoon Claire. Her inbox filled with emails, some calling her an inspiration, others accusing her of spreading pseudoscience. Her colleagues at the university were quick to weigh in, most of them privately and a few publicly. "Interesting anecdote, Claire," read one text from a fellow ecologist. "But don't let them make you the poster child for animal empathy." Another colleague emailed, "Fascinating, but if you talk to the press about horse compassion, you'll never get a grant again." The university held a panel about her experience. Claire attended via video, her leg in a cast, fielding questions from academics. Most asked for data. Where's your evidence? Did you document the horse's behavior? Was there video aside from the blurry rescue footage? When she tried to describe the herd's actions, some faces grew skeptical. One older professor scoffed, "Are we really to believe a wild stallion acted as a conscious guardian? This is precisely why fieldwork must be objective." At night, Claire replayed those hours in the canyon, her memory refusing to let go of the feeling when Phantom stood above her, as if weighing a decision. She remembered the deliberate circle the herd had formed, the colt's gentle nudge, the shared breath and warmth. It was so much more than instinct. It was presence, agency. But as the noise of public debate swelled, Claire retreated. She avoided the news. She turned down offers for more interviews. Even her friends began to tread carefully, unsure whether to celebrate or challenge her story. The line between fact and myth had blurred. The pressure to provide a scientific explanation pressed down on her. But in her heart, she knew that trying to force a rational answer would betray the truth of what she'd lived. She attended physical therapy, her legs slowly regaining strength, her limp a daily reminder of the canyon. More than once, she caught herself daydreaming, not of the ordeal, but of the herd. She missed the way the wild felt at dawn, the silence only broken by horses' steady breaths. She missed the sense of connection, raw and ancient, that had filled her when Phantom met her gaze. One morning, a package arrived at her door. Inside was a framed photo taken by a rescue team member. It showed her, wrapped in silver, with Phantom's silhouette on the canyon rim. The note read, "I saw it too. Some things can't be explained." Claire smiled for the first time in days, tears stinging her eyes. She thought about visiting the canyon again, though she knew how reckless it would seem to others. But she couldn't let the story end in a hospital room or a conference call. Something inside her had shifted. The wild was calling, not just for study, but for understanding. In the following weeks, Claire received countless invitations to speak at conferences, appear on podcasts, consult on documentaries. She said no to most of them, feeling unready to be the public face of a debate she didn't want to win. What she wanted was truth, not the kind measured in statistics, but the kind that lived in quiet choices, in a stallion's steady courage. Each night, she relived the moment Phantom had planted himself between her and the storm, had stood his ground when he could have fled. No matter what the world believed, Claire carried that certainty with her, a new kind of faith, forged in the wild, tempered by silence. And with each passing day, as the media storm slowly faded, she found herself growing restless. The answers she sought could not be found in newsrooms or lecture halls. Only in the high desert, in the canyon where the wild stood still, would she have a chance to understand. For weeks, Claire's mind was never far from the canyon. As spring bled into a burning Nevada summer, the outside world's curiosity faded, but hers only intensified. While her body healed, she replayed every moment with the Mustangs, especially Phantom's gaze and the Colt's innocent insistence on connection. Despite the skepticism swirling around her in the academic community, Claire knew she had to go back. But this time, she resolved to return without the armor of science. No data loggers, no drones, not even a notebook. She wanted nothing between herself and the truth of the wild. Her limp was pronounced as she hiked, the injury a reminder with every step. Claire chose a day just before dawn, when the sky blushed faintly pink and the desert was still cool. Her pack was lighter now, just water, some snacks, and a sketchbook. The wind brushed her cheeks, carrying the distant scent of wild sage. Each step over gravel, each heartbeat echoing in the hush, reminded her she was alone, but not as she'd once been. As she neared the canyon rim, a surge of emotion tightened her throat. The last time she'd seen this view, she'd been in agony, convinced she would die. Now her survival felt like a kind of unfinished story, one whose ending she had to find for herself. She paused, scanning the ground, searching for clues, hoofprints, flattened grass, any sign that the Mustangs had returned. At the spot where she'd fallen, the earth still bore scars, a few broken stones, a shallow rut where her body had slid, flecks of silver from her blanket snagged on a low bush. She crouched and touched the soil, feeling the heat stored from so many days under the desert sun. Phantom's hoofprints, she was almost sure, were there, overlapping with those of the herd, faded but unmistakable. For a long moment Claire knelt, eyes closed, breathing in the dry, wild air. "I came back," she whispered, unsure if she was speaking to herself or the land or the horses she hoped were watching from some hidden place. The canyon was eerily silent, not even a bird's call to break the hush. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but unlike before when her rational mind would have catalogued her fear, now she simply allowed it to exist, part of the landscape she was trying to understand. She waited, not calling, not moving, just letting herself be. A snort, a sharp, unmistakable sound, cracked the stillness. Claire's head whipped up. There, on the far side of the clearing, half shielded by scrub and sunlight, stood Phantom. Even from a distance he was unmistakable, silver coat, proud stance, a mane streaked with dust and thunder. His presence was like an answer to a question she hadn't known how to ask. Phantom stared at her, unblinking, assessing. There was no wind, no tension, just a long moment of mutual recognition. Claire's heart hammered, but she didn't move. She kept her hands open and low, showing she brought nothing but herself. Then slowly she stood, awkward with her limp, every movement careful. She took a step forward, then another, until she stood at the edge of the open space between them. Phantom stamped his hoof once but didn't back away. From behind him, the colt poked his head out, ears pricked, already braver than before. Claire spoke softly, as if to a nervous child. "You remember me, don't you?" The stallion's ears flicked, and the colt took a few hesitant steps closer. Claire's throat tightened, not with fear, but with awe. She didn't reach out. She just stood, letting the silence speak, letting the air between them fill with trust. The colt, emboldened by Phantom's calm, danced in a wide circle around her, kicking up little puffs of dust. Claire couldn't help but laugh, the sound ringing out, free and unburdened. It startled a few nearby birds, but Phantom only watched, steady as ever. Slowly, Claire eased herself to the ground, sitting cross-legged in the grass. She pulled out her sketchbook, not to record data, but to capture a moment. Her hand moved almost unconsciously, tracing the outline of the herd, the tilt of Phantom's head, the colt's playful arc. It was a kind of communion, the act of drawing, an offering, not a measurement. Phantom, watching her, seemed to relax. He stepped forward, closing the distance by a few careful strides. The rest of the herd materialized from the brush, mares and yearlings, all with the same alert, intelligent gaze. They fanned out behind their leader, watching Claire with curiosity rather than fear. For the first time, Claire realized she wasn't just a visitor in their world. She was being invited, on their terms, not hers. The old walls she'd built up, the ones reinforced by years of science and sorrow, felt suddenly thin. She set her sketchbook aside and simply sat, breathing in the presence of the wild. The minutes stretched, and the sun rose higher. The air grew warm, insects buzzing low to the ground. The Mustangs grazed nearby, some wandering closer, others watching from a safe distance. The colt came right up to her, nosing at her shoes, his whiskers tickling her fingers. Claire grinned, letting the joy spill over, untethered by logic or analysis. She stayed for hours, moving only when the herd shifted, following their lead. At one point, Phantom lowered himself to the ground, an act of vulnerability few wild horses ever showed near a human. Claire felt honored, humbled beyond words. She made no attempt to tag, photograph, or document them for any audience but herself. Instead, she filled page after page of her sketchbook with quick drawings, snippets of movement, and single lines capturing the grace and strength she saw before her. As the sun climbed and the shadows shortened, Claire felt something inside her settle. She understood now that the answers she'd come seeking weren't facts to be filed away, but moments to be lived. She was no longer measuring wildness by distance or risk or data points. She was measuring it by presence, by the simple, courageous act of being together, in trust, on a patch of desert earth. Before she left, Claire stood and bowed her head to Phantom, a gesture of thanks. The stallion watched, regal and unhurried, and the colt whinnied softly as if in farewell. She limped away from the canyon with the sun on her back, her soul lighter than it had felt in years. And as she reached the ridge and looked back, she saw the herd still watching, no longer ghosts in a legend, but friends, keepers of a truth beyond words. Claire's return to the canyon marked a transformation in her approach, not only to her work, but to her life. Gone were the field loggers and digital cameras, the relentless drive to quantify and categorize every facet of the wild. Now, as she limped down the familiar trail each morning, she carried only a battered sketchbook, a single pencil, and a willingness to be fully present. Each step was an act of faith. Faith that the Mustangs would remember her, that the trust they'd shown was not a fleeting gift. The first few days, Claire kept her distance, content to observe. Phantom and the herd appeared like ghosts at dawn, grazing quietly in the sunlit meadows and among the red rocks. The colt, emboldened since that stormy night, sometimes broke from the group to prance closer, nostrils flaring, as if daring Claire to chase him. She never did. Instead, she greeted him with a slow wave, an easy smile, and, most importantly, stillness. One afternoon, the colt changed the rhythm. With a burst of youthful energy, he bolted from his mother's side, galloping circles around Claire where she sat cross-legged, sketchbook on her lap. Dust kicked up in playful clouds as he bucked, whinnied, and darted toward her, only to veer away at the last second. Phantom watched from a distance, regal and calm, but allowed the game. Claire laughed, a clear, ringing sound that carried up the canyon walls. It was a sound she hadn't heard from herself in years. Emboldened by the colt, other horses began to approach. A chestnut mare grazed within arm's reach, her tail swishing flies away from both of them. Claire sketched quickly, not as a scientist but as someone learning the shapes of old friends. She noticed details she would have missed in her former frantic pace. The subtle patterns of scars on Phantom's flank, the way the herd breathed in unison when at rest, the tiny, ever-shifting hierarchy among the yearlings. It was more than behavior. It was life, rich, unpredictable, and irreducibly wild. Days melted into one another, and with each return, Claire found herself growing braver. She tried, cautiously, to imitate the horse's body language, moving slowly, eyes soft, hands always visible. On the 5th day, something miraculous happened. Phantom, after sniffing the wind and glancing at the colt, lowered himself into the grass a dozen feet from Claire. He lay down, shoulders first, then legs folded beneath him, and relaxed. In the wild, for a stallion to lie down near a human was unthinkable. Claire knew the risk he was taking, the trust he was giving. She laid her pencil aside and sat, unmoving, letting the silence bloom between them. For an hour they shared the meadow. The colt wandered over, sniffed Claire's outstretched hand, then curled up beside Phantom, dark eyes growing heavy. The mare dozed nearby. Claire's thoughts slowed to match the peaceful tempo of the herd. For the first time since her sister's death, she felt the raw ache of loss soften, replaced by something bittersweet, a sense that connection was still possible, even in a world shaped by grief. Over the next week, the boundaries between Claire and the Mustangs grew more porous. She returned at sunrise and sunset, sometimes simply sitting, other times sketching the herd at play. She watched the colt and the yearlings race each other, sometimes tripping in the sage, sometimes tumbling into laughter, her own laughter unguarded, echoing theirs. The more time she spent, the more she noticed how much of their lives existed beyond the reach of data. A stolen apple from a nearby tree, a sudden rolling in the dust just for the joy of it, a careful nuzzle when one of the mares got spooked by a distant coyote. Gradually, Claire's thoughts began to shift. She had always believed in the importance of rational inquiry, of science as a tool to understand the world. Yet here in the hush of the canyon, she realized that some truths couldn't be measured or even named. They could only be lived. The wild, she now understood, was not just a setting for her research. It was a living presence, a partner in a dance she could never fully lead or predict. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the western ridge and the sky turned molten gold, Claire found herself standing beside Phantom at the edge of the clearing. The stallion looked at her. No fear, no challenge, just quiet regard. For a heartbeat, Claire reached out, and her fingers brushed his shoulder. The contact was electric, brief, light, and utterly voluntary. Phantom didn't flinch. Instead, he lowered his head and exhaled, a soft, rumbling sigh that sounded almost like acceptance. The next morning brought a new ritual. After the herd greeted the day, the colt trotted up, nudged Claire's pocket, and waited. Laughing, she produced a smooth stone, one she'd found near the old creek bed, and rolled it across the ground. The colt pawed at it, then kicked it back. Soon, the two of them were engaged in a playful game that seemed to amuse the entire herd. Even Phantom, staid and stoic, watched with something like pride. Claire began to record these moments, not as research, but as memories. Her sketchbook filled with images of movement, of rest, of connection. Instead of data points and field notes, she wrote single words: trust, choice, presence, wild. She saw now how much had been missing from her old way of seeing the world. She realized how much she'd been taught to divide life into categories: wild versus domestic, rational versus emotional, observer versus observed, when the truth was infinitely more fluid. She even found herself talking aloud, not just to the horses, but to herself, voicing thoughts she'd kept buried for years. Maybe, she murmured one dusk, as Phantom grazed nearby, the point isn't to measure everything. Maybe the point is just to be here, to bear witness, to belong. That evening, as the desert air cooled and the sky filled with the first scatter of stars, Claire sat surrounded by the herd, the colt dozing at her feet. She felt a peace she hadn't known she was searching for. The boundaries between her and the wild had softened, not erased, but transformed into something mutual, earned by patience, given in trust, and renewed with every shared sunrise. The wild wasn't hers to own, define, or control. It was a gift, a presence she could choose to meet again and again, so long as she remembered how to show up with nothing in her hands but wonder. The new rhythm of Claire's life was simple: sunrise in the canyon, slow, unmeasured hours in the presence of the herd, sketchbook in hand and heart unguarded. Each day, the trust between her and the Mustangs deepened. Phantom would sometimes graze near her shoulder. The colt played their little stone game, and the other mares accepted her as a harmless part of the wild tapestry. For weeks, the world outside, the clamor of media, the skepticism of academia, faded until it felt like another life. But the world is never content to leave a good story untouched. It comes pounding at the edges, demanding attention, threatening the fragile peace you've carved out for yourself. Claire had forgotten that lesson, lulled by the silence and the slow-building miracle of being accepted by wild creatures on their terms. The lesson would come crashing back to her on a bright, brittle morning that began as quietly as any other. She arrived at the rim before dawn, dew clinging to her boots, sketchbook under her arm. The air was crisp, the sky a flawless stretch of blue. In the clearing below, Phantom stood sentinel as always, mane rippling in the faint breeze. The herd grazed peacefully. The colt spotted her first and trotted over, tail high, expecting the day's ritual. Claire knelt to meet him, laughing as he butted her hand, demanding their usual game. There was no warning, no hint of danger on the wind. The first jarring sound came from behind, the harsh, unmistakable whine of engines. Claire stiffened. The noise grew louder, the kind of growl only made by machines built to conquer wilderness. ATVs, maybe 3 or 4 of them, tearing up the old track that zigzagged along the canyon's shoulder. She stood up, heart racing, and watched as a cloud of dust crested the hill. The riders wore camo jackets and mirrored sunglasses, cheap tripods strapped to their backs. Wildlife photographers. Not the quiet, respectful kind, but thrill seekers, the sort who posted adrenaline clips for viral likes. Claire's blood ran cold. She'd seen enough online to know what came next: chasing, cornering, forcing wild animals to run for the camera. The Mustangs felt the shift instantly. Ears snapped forward, tails rose, muscles tensed. Phantom stamped, snorted, and moved between Claire and his herd. The mares began bunching up, eyes rolling white, ready to bolt. "Hey, over there!" shouted one of the riders, spotting the horses. The engines revved, the men grinning and waving their phones. Get the silver one. He's a beauty. Make him run. The herd exploded into motion. Phantom herded the others, driving them toward the far end of the canyon. Claire ran, stumbling after them, waving her arms. Stop! Leave them alone! Her voice was swallowed by engine roar and the ugly cacophony of shouted instructions. One ATV cut off the main group, heading straight for the colt. The little horse dodged at the last second, hooves skidding perilously close to the rocks. Claire's heart nearly stopped. Phantom wheeled, coming between the ATV and the colt, eyes wild with terror and rage. Get out of here! Claire screamed, putting herself between the ATV and the Mustangs, waving her arms as the machine bore down. The rider hesitated. Her fury, her limping charge, was enough to give even a reckless intruder pause. She locked eyes with the man, her glare harder than stone. You want a shot? Take it of me. Leave them alone. Behind her, Phantom whinnied, a sound torn from the heart of the earth, furious and pleading. The mares bunched up, the colt pressed into his dam's side, trembling. The other riders, seeing Claire's intervention, began to curse and jeer. Lady, move! You're ruining our footage! Claire refused. She stood her ground, breath heaving, adrenaline surging through her pain. These horses saved my life. You'll go through me before you get to them. For a long, agonizing moment, the standoff held. The engines sputtered, the riders revved, and the air crackled with threat. Then, finally, with a series of muttered insults, the men relented, turning their ATVs and roaring off in a storm of dust and disappointment. The silence that followed was suffocating. Claire fell to her knees, shaking from adrenaline and fear. She turned, scanning for the herd. The Mustangs had vanished into the thickest part of the brush, their forms nothing more than ghosts in the morning sun. She called softly, voice trembling. Phantom. Hey, buddy. It's okay. They're gone. Only the wind answered. The hush felt heavier now, thick with guilt and regret. She waited for hours, calling, coaxing, leaving pieces of apple on the rocks, hoping the herd would emerge. But the clearing remained empty. When the sun reached its zenith, Claire hiked to every spot she'd come to know as their resting places, each one silent, abandoned. No hoofprints, no silver glint of a mane, no flicker of a colt's tail. A pit formed in her stomach. She remembered the rules she'd learned from old ranchers and trackers. Wild trust is the rarest currency, easily lost, almost impossible to earn twice. She'd promised herself she would never be the danger, never be the reason for fear. But the world had found them, and she feared that trust had shattered. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and longing. Every dawn she returned, sitting quietly for hours, whispering apologies into the wind. The apple slices shriveled and browned, untouched. Her sketchbook filled only with empty clearings and distant hills. Claire berated herself, replaying every moment. Should she have been more vigilant? Could she have warned the herd sooner? The questions gnawed at her, guilt growing heavier with every fruitless search. Her body ached with exhaustion, her heart heavier with the sense that something precious had been broken, maybe forever. One evening, as the sun bled out behind the far ridge, Claire remained in the canyon long after the shadows stretched. She whispered into the dusk, voice hoarse. I'm sorry. I should have protected you. You trusted me, and I let the world find you. The only answer was silence. She packed her sketchbook and hiked home in the dark, her limp pronounced, every step echoing with loss. The wild had given her a rare gift, a connection without measure, a belonging without possession. Now it felt as if that gift had been taken back, a price paid for letting the human world intrude. But even in her despair, Claire knew one truth. If trust could be earned once, it might, just might, be earned again, with patience, humility, and the willingness to keep showing up, even when hope seemed lost. Claire's world shrank to a ritual of waiting. Every morning before sunrise, she'd make her way back to the canyon, each step heavy with the dread that maybe the herd had left for good. The wild had always been unforgiving. She knew that. What she hadn't anticipated was how much it hurt to be exiled, not by violence or anger, but by a silence that pressed in, day after day, where there had once been the soft exhale of Mustangs and the feeling of acceptance. The world outside the canyon, emails, deadlines, news feeds, felt like static, meaningless compared to the emptiness the herd's absence left behind. She kept searching for some sign, some forgiveness, as summer deepened. Some days she would catch the faintest impression of hoofprints in the dust, or the ghost of a mane in the brush far off the trail. Each time hope would flare and then sputter out, replaced by aching loneliness. She blamed herself, again and again, for failing to protect them from the intrusion of the human world, for letting trust be shattered by noise and arrogance. But the canyon itself changed her. There was a lesson in the patience required to show up with no guarantee of reward. She'd bring her sketchbook, but most days she drew only shadows and empty fields. Sometimes she spoke aloud, voice raw, as if the wind might carry her words to the horses she missed. "I'm still here," she'd whisper. "I'll wait as long as you need." One morning she arrived just before the first blush of dawn. The air was heavy with dew, the canyon rim a ribbon of pale light. As she set down her pack, something odd caught her eye. Right on her jacket, left draped over a low bush, was a single silver hair. Not old and brittle, but fresh, shining in the new sun. Claire stared, hardly daring to believe. Her heart began to pound, and she scanned the clearing for any other sign. Down the trail, half hidden among the scattered rocks and wildflowers, a series of hoofprints curved away from the spot where she always sat. Her hands trembled as she knelt, touching the prints, feeling their depth, the way they overlapped and circled. They were recent, hours old, maybe less. Claire straightened, heart swelling with cautious hope. She waited, motionless, hardly breathing. And then, as the sun crept higher, she saw them. Phantom first, standing at the edge of the trees, silver mane glowing. The colt was there too, taller and more confident, followed by the familiar shapes of the mares. The herd emerged quietly, without drama, their presence calm and steady. It was as if nothing had happened, as if forgiveness could be granted by a single shared sunrise. Claire couldn't move. Her relief was so overwhelming, it brought tears to her eyes. She didn't call out or rush forward. She simply sat, head bowed, accepting the moment for what it was. Phantom watched her, then walked a few slow steps closer, nostrils flaring. The colt, ever bold, approached her pack, sniffed at the apples she'd brought, then looked up at Claire with those wide, wild eyes. She laughed, soft, shaky, and utterly free. "Thank you," she whispered, voice breaking. The herd settled in the clearing, grazing, rolling in the dust, doing what wild horses always did, living fully, unapologetically, in the present. Claire felt a knot in her chest loosen, the weight of guilt finally easing. Weeks passed, and the rhythm rebuilt itself. Trust came back slowly, one gesture at a time. The herd never came quite as close as before, but they didn't run. They let Claire share their space, their silence, and their sunrise. With every day she returned, their acceptance felt like a gift that had to be earned anew. It was this, more than anything, that led Claire to reconsider her work. She was asked to speak at a major conservation conference, and for days she struggled with what to say. She had always been a scientist first, cautious with words, careful never to romanticize or project human motives onto wild creatures. But her time in the canyon, her exile and return, had shown her a deeper truth. Standing before the crowd, Claire paused, searching for the right place to begin. She looked at the faces, policymakers, biologists, activists, skeptics. She took a breath. "I used to believe," she began, "that wild animals were only ever acting on instinct, that everything could be explained by need, hunger, fear, survival, and maybe most of the time, that's true. But last spring, a wild stallion and his herd did something no textbook ever prepared me for. They stood their ground, not just for themselves, but for me, a stranger and a threat, in the middle of a storm. When the world intruded, when I lost their trust, they disappeared. But today I stand here because they chose to come back. Not out of training or reward, out of something like forgiveness." The room was silent. Claire pressed on, voice steady, heart pounding. "I'm not here to argue that wild horses think like we do, but I know this. Empathy is not human territory alone. What saved me in that canyon wasn't instinct or luck. It was a choice, theirs, not mine. And if we can't recognize that wildness carries its own intelligence, its own ways of choosing and forgiving, then we're missing the point." She paused, letting her words sink in. Then she urged, with quiet conviction, "Our policies need to respect not just biology, but the deeper connections that make conservation worth doing. The wild doesn't forget. It gives, it withholds, it remembers. And we, as stewards, must do the same." The applause that followed was hesitant at first, then grew, filling the hall. Claire saw faces softened by wonder, some by doubt, but many by a kind of recognition. Maybe they had their own stories of the wild refusing easy explanations. Afterward, a young student caught up with her in the hallway. "Do you really believe animals can choose compassion?" the girl asked. Claire smiled, thinking of Phantom's steady gaze, the silver hair left as a message, the herd's slow forgiveness. "I believe we have a lot more to learn from them than we think, and I believe that trust, once earned, changes both sides forever." She returned to the canyon that evening, the air heavy with the scent of rain. The herd greeted her in the dusk, and Claire sat with them, sketchbook open, heart open too. The wild had forgiven her, not with words, but with presence. And in that presence, Claire found something even deeper than survival, a truth that could never be measured, only lived. The canyon's memory was long, and so was Claire's. Over the months that followed her return, she came to understand that the story the world wanted, a clean tale of rescue, of wild heroism, was only the beginning. The truth, as she lived it, was far richer, stranger, and more humbling. She would say as much whenever asked, but the real answer was written in days spent under the sun with Phantom and his herd, in silences that needed no translation, and in the subtle but permanent shift in her own heart. With her physical strength restored and her limp now only a gentle reminder, Claire made the canyon her sanctuary. She began to bring students and young researchers, not for data collection or tagging, but to sit, to listen, to witness. "You don't need a drone to understand the wild," she told them. "You need patience, you need humility. You need to show up again and again without demanding anything in return." The mentorship program she started became her legacy. Young scientists, eager and skeptical, would come with their gadgets and checklists only to find themselves days later staring in awe at a stallion who might, if he chose, allow them to stand within 10 feet. The greatest lesson, Claire insisted, was not about the horses themselves, but about what it meant to be truly present in the world. To respect what you cannot control, to cherish what you cannot possess, to witness what you can never fully explain. At conferences and in classrooms, Claire's story took on a life of its own. She was invited everywhere, asked to speak on panels about the ethics of observation, animal intelligence, empathy in the wild. Yet she always brought her message back to the beginning. Not the night she was saved, but the long days after, the slow rebuilding of trust, the understanding that true connection cannot be forced. She learned to say it simply, letting her words land with the same gravity as the silences she'd shared with Phantom. I went into the canyon to measure land. I came out measuring love. When interviewers asked what Phantom had meant to her, Claire would answer, "He didn't owe me anything. He didn't speak, didn't try to comfort me as a person might. But he stayed. He chose to stand still, to be present, when he could have run. That choice changed my life more than any act of rescue." The impact of her story spread beyond the small circle of scientists and conservationists. Families came to the canyon, hoping for a glimpse of the wild herd. Children wrote letters, sending drawings of silver stallions and brave colts. Claire made it a rule to protect the herd's privacy, teaching others to admire from a distance, to appreciate without disturbing, to love without possession. Some evenings, as dusk crept over the land, Claire would walk alone along the canyon rim, sketchbook tucked under her arm. She often found herself thinking about her sister, the sharp laughter, the memories of old storms and whispered promises. In the herd's quiet company, those wounds had finally begun to heal. The wild had given her not just a second chance at life, but a new way to live it. On the anniversary of the storm, Claire held a small ceremony at the canyon's edge with her students. They read poems and shared stories, not just about horses, but about moments of grace in the wild, about choosing compassion even when no one is watching. As the sun set, Phantom appeared, as if summoned by memory or fate, the colt now nearly grown at his side. The students stood in hushed wonder as the herd grazed nearby, untamed and utterly free. Claire watched the silver stallion, her heart full. She realized she had been asking the wrong question all along. It wasn't, "Why did the horses save me?" It was, "How did I need saving?" The canyon had shown her that the boundaries between human and wild, between rational and emotional, were far thinner than she had ever believed. What mattered most was not the science, not the fame, but the willingness to keep showing up with humility and an open heart. She closed her public talk that night with words she'd been waiting all year to say. Real protection doesn't always roar. It stands still when it matters most. I once believed wild animals were driven only by instinct. But what if, like us, they can choose compassion? And what if true connection isn't taught, but earned, by showing up again and again, even when no one's watching? Afterward, in the hush after applause, Claire and her students sat by the fire, stars flaring overhead. Someone asked if she ever wished she could go back to the certainty of science, to the safety of numbers and hard data. Claire shook her head, smiling softly. "I used to think being rescued meant being carried out, being saved from danger. Now I know it can mean something else. Being seen, being accepted, being changed. Sometimes you think you're measuring the wild. Sometimes you discover the wild is measuring you." She looked out at the shadowy forms of the herd, breathing easy under the night sky. In that moment, there was nothing left to prove, only a truth that would echo long after the last story was told. We are at our best when we learn to stand still for one another. As dawn crept into the canyon, Phantom and the grown colt walked with Claire along the ridge. No fences, no words, just the quiet bond of trust earned through time, respect, and choice. No one needed to speak. The lesson was in every hoofprint, every moment of presence, every act of silent protection. Claire understood at last. The wild had rescued her as surely as she'd been rescued from it. And because of that, she was changed, able finally to walk beside the wild, not as a conqueror or observer, but as a witness and a friend.